Perfect. All set.
Or that worked out pretty easily. All right, so I'm calling to order the Ad Hoc Sustainability and Resilience Committee of the Common Council. Today is September 15th, and we're beginning the meeting at 6:05. And calling the roll, I see Mr. Livingston's here, Dominique Johnson's here, as well as Josh Goldstein. We have a couple other committee members who might be joining us later. We'll see what happens. So the first order of business is public participation. Is there anyone here who would like to be heard?
Yes.
If you would like to be heard, please raise your hand, and then Katie will allow you to each speak one at a time. The limit for public participation is 3 minutes a person.
One member of the public has raised her hand.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Looks like it's Ms. Laura Cella. Good evening, Diane. If you'd like to speak, it looks as though you're unmuted.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, my name is Diane Lauricella. I wasn't going to speak, but I did get a chance to quickly go through the draft. I want to reiterate what I said the first day that you met, that I was very happy that the administration and this council saw fit to have an ad hoc committee. I offered my expertise and people that I know that could have helped you. Madam Chairwoman, I would like to speak with you offline because I've never been given the benefit of a phone call or welcoming or an email from the staff or Dr. Welkel for my 25-year plus expertise as well as dedication to Norwalk. So I just want that on the record because I do think spending just a little bit of time with me can assist. And so places where this might be helpful is because I am an environmental consultant. I find the format of this draft a little awkward. And I would suggest if TNC does not have that, and I don't know all of, I haven't looked at their contract, that they might want to consider reorganizing the draft so it's a little easier to read and put together and find solutions at the end of the read. I know that this is just the beginning of the draft. As an example, we're talking, of course, about the concerns, and there was discussion about energy. There is not enough, in my opinion, and I am on the Connecticut Green Building Council, just as a reference to the staff that are mostly new in Norwalk, and I think that's part of the issue here, that it would be helpful to have microgrids and a real deep dive into the different types of energy in a hurricane or when we have extreme weather. There are many other ways to get our sewage treatment plant, keep it online, and these have not been explored. Second thing is, I was hoping someone would have called me or spoken with me because for those of you that are new on the council, there was the mayor asked me to put together an energy task force in 2014. I did that. Unfortunately, Mr. Kaitis was the chair, and so we didn't really cover what you all are doing now, but the intent was to try to give an assessment of where the city's departments need to step up, change some things, maybe reorganize. And that's, we formed there was a matrix that was put together. So I very much would love Adam Welkel and others and all of you to take a look at that matrix. The matrix is online. I put together the matrix. It was put into Excel spreadsheet by Steve Clockey, who I hope will admit that the words are mine, and it could be very useful in your future deliberations in getting this, whipping this into shape. Lastly, I just wanted to say that the projects list, I would love you to allow some of us that have a lot more expertise in science and environmental management to take a look at the list. I guess that's been submitted to the regional planning agency. I just find that a lot of our projects that are in the are listed in the 80s. Now, maybe I have to talk to the gentleman from Western Connecticut, the COG, but they should have a much higher ranking than what I saw, especially number 13, 14, 44, and 45. Professionally speaking, I don't feel those deserve
That's a
more,
3-1.
more of a ranking. So lastly, just brownfields and potential brownfields map. Again, Mr. Badoli and Chairman and Katie, I made my living years ago and even up to now addressing and assessing brownfields. And so I would very much like offline to have a discussion about how to truly integrate public participation as you have vowed in the body of this document. And so I think that the public would be best served because we can't, as we all know, climate change is here. We can't wait for politics to allow some of the public to be involved in a meaningful way. And I just would say thank you. I will have more to say in writing. I'll forward it to you, but this is the best I could do. I just saw the draft last night. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Lauricella. Katie, are there any other hands raised, or and that we can take Diane off of the yeah, thank you. Are there any other hands raised or comments that we need to read into the record from emails?
There are no other hands raised, but there is one comment to read.
Great, thank you. Please read that for the record.
Comment from Linnell Jones for the Sustainability and Resilience Committee meeting, September 15th, 2022. Thank you for reading these during the public comment period and including them in your minutes. This is an interesting summary of findings, including who was and was not involved. The draft being presented today from a May 2022 workshop followed the delayed publication this year of the City of Norwalk's annual stormwater management plan, a document required every year under Norwalk's MS4 permit. This workshop also followed my public comment on the annual 2021 stormwater management plan, which was shared with your committee and many city leaders listed in this summary. If coastal flooding is listed as the City of Norwalk's #1 hazard, then why has the City of Norwalk allowed certain coastal neighborhoods, like my neighborhood, Wilson Point, to avoid required coastal permits, the filling of tidal wetlands, and not enforced inland wetland state regulations? Thank you for looking into this and getting back to me, Linnell Jones.
Great, thank you. And I think Ms. Jones also asked that we include in the record some of her correction to her comments, which we can add to the minutes of this meeting for the last meeting minutes, right? We'll do that. Okay, great. Okay, so the next order of business is the approval of minutes for our May 11th, 2022 meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes as they are filed? Mr. Livingston has moved. Thank you. Does anybody have any corrections or comments or thoughts to add to the minutes as they stand? Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Chair. Just for clarification, those corrections from the resident you were mentioning would be part as amended, right? Correct?
No, they're just going to be added to this
Added
sheet.
to it. Okay, good.
Yeah, to this,
Just to confirm.
yeah, her comments went beyond just the corrections of the minutes as she viewed it. So we're just going to add her comments to the minutes of today.
Very good. Appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, exactly. It was her comments went beyond just a correction. Anything else? Okay, seeing that there's no comments to make any changes to the May 11th minutes, well, do we have, yeah, we have enough people for a quorum. We've got 4 of us, right? So we can, 4 of us, right? Good, so we can vote on the minutes, all in favor. There's 4 of us, they are passed. Thank you. So the next order of business is the fun part of the meeting. On May 26th, the City of Norwalk, in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, hosted a community resilience building workshop. And this community workshop was at the recommendation of Brian Jolie, who had gone through a similar process with the Nature Conservancy in Bridgeport. So I will turn the meeting over to Brian to give the background of how this came together and our summary of findings. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Brian, and for taking us through this meeting. These minutes.
Thank you so much. It's nice to see you all. I hope you had a nice summer. During the summer, we're obviously working with the Nature Conservancy to compile the summary of findings report that was provided with the agenda. It's obviously in draft format. Really tonight, I just wanted to walk you through where we're at, where we ended up on May 26th, tell you a little bit about the process and then some of the outcomes. We had a really good discussion among a lot of very interested parties that work within the city, that are engaged with the city. And I think we really generated a lot of information that's going to help carry us forward as we continue the larger planning effort that we all hope to engage in refining some of these, identifying different actions, and then doing additional analysis. This, as we had talked, was really just the first cut. The Nature Conservancy was kind enough to offer us a pro bono service, which they offered to a number of communities to help us really develop a plan for ourselves and really just bring us together on a one-day event to have a deep dive conversation on resilience and the impacts and the future impacts of climate change. And that's really what's reflected in this report. So in terms of the overall process, it's referred to as the community resilience building process. This is actually sort of a patent pending exercise from the Nature Conservancy that we started back in 2010 in Bridgeport with our the first workshop actually Adam and I were able to do together. I think he's since done close to 100 plus of them since. So he moved on without me, which is probably for the best. But he really has refined the process, how to engage, how to be a facilitator, and really just create a plan that it's Norwalk's plan. And that's why he asked that I present today. It's really our plan to do what we want with it and to take the findings, take the information, and then carry those forward into other planning efforts and design initiatives. And really, it's a unique process. It's a community-driven process, full of information that we're trying to do in terms of community leaders, people that are working with the community, that are dealing with this every day, working with their experience, having deep dialogue, where we talk about what are the top hazards that Norwalk's facing, what are our current strengths. There's a big component and focus on first identifying our strengths and then taking a look at the challenges that might impede those strengths and what we could do in the future, identify these priority actions to help improve community resilience for all hazards today. So we start there. We started there with the process saying, okay, what is Norwalk experiencing? What are the issue areas? And then how will new circumstances affect that in the future? And, a large one of that, of course, is climate change, right? And we looked at that through an all hazards approach, and we had a very active discussion, which I'll talk a little bit about tonight. So, in just general overview, there's obviously, as this group has been formed to tackle, there's a need to increase resilience to weather events and climate change. And making the effort now will help reduce our overall vulnerability and reinforce the strength of Norwalk as a whole. We took a look at it from a sort of a social, environmental, economic, and infrastructure focus, really trying to figure out a way where Norwalk can stand as a model for other communities in Connecticut and New England. And we were fortunate, as I said, to have the Nature Conservancy, Clean Air, Cool Planet, and a number of other partners come together pro bono for us to sit down and have these discussions that we all believe in. So in terms of the actual specific process, a lot of you might recall we, obviously brought it to your attention, having initial pre-workshop conversations, telling everyone sort of what we had hoped to do, that this is obviously the first step in a series of steps that we're looking to increase our overall planning for resilience. We identified a number of stakeholders who should be in the meeting, recognizing that there's constraints on the size because, obviously it ended up being a Zoom event, and just wanted to make sure that we were able to facilitate the workshop in a format that worked based on Adam's experience, working in a number of communities. We pulled together, the first step we took, the Nature Conservancy took, was to look at all existing plans to see what's already been identified to make sure that we weren't missing anything. We offered and received great responses to a pre-workshop questionnaire where we unearthed a lot of new data, information that we wanted to make sure we were considering going into the meeting. And Adam Welch actually provided a report in terms of what the findings were of that at the beginning of that meeting at our workshop. And then so we went through the workshop process, which I'll detail a little bit later in the presentation. And obviously what the outcome was this summary of findings. I think, it's back in May, but I do, the big outcome that I remembered was the charge up that it gave to everybody that was, in staff, internal to the city, to the council, just everyone sort of speaking the same language, even though they came from different perspectives. And I think there was a lot of momentum, a lot of excitement. And what I'm hoping is that this plan, the release is just going to, advance that discussion now. We have a lot of opportunity with the next step, which I know we're all talking about, doing a larger sustainability, resilience, and climate action plan. And this is really the catalyst. This is the raw material that we can help feed to a future consultant to help us work through our list of objectives. You'll note that it was very exhaustive. There's a lot of, I don't want to call it a letter to Santa because it's something that we all want to strive for, but it's very long and exhaustive. And we try to just do a full data dump of our collective brain is the best way I could sort of frame it. And then from there, we'll be able to curate, we'll be able to refine, we'll be able to bring in more analytical tools with the climate action plan. But this is really that raw material to give us a jump start on the next steps. So the people that helped with this, and I can't thank them enough. I mean, organizing something like this, just in terms of, pulling together the who, what, where, when, but also just the background and context and all the things that we need to start to be thinking about as part of our resilience planning are listed here. We had Tom Livingston, Lisa Shanahan, myself, Jess Vonishek, Steve Kleppen, Alicia King, Vanessa, and Anthony. This is just the list of people that were at the start trying to put this thing together. It obviously blossomed to a much larger effort, and we hope it's going to continue to blossom in terms of who we're involving and the depth of the bench that we're pulling from to advance this planning work. So in terms of the ultimate objectives, we wanted to sit down as a group and define the top local, natural, and climate-related hazards of concern. As I'll talk, this is the flooding, this is the drought, this is the heat effects. And kind of define those as sort of our, independent variable that we then look at our vulnerabilities and strengths. So trying to identify existing and future strengths and vulnerabilities, identify then prioritize actions, obviously what you could do in a day as we're sitting there, negotiating them out as groups. Identify opportunities to collaboratively, advance our overall actions and resilience on a variety of axioms. And I think that's the key thing with any of this. It's not just an environmental problem, it's an equity problem, it's an economic problem, it's an overall social problem that we all have to recognize that when you pull one lever, another lever goes down, another lever goes up, and we're trying to do a holistic approach to that to increase our overall resilience. So as I mentioned, some of the top hazards that were identified by the core team prior to the workshop were obviously flooding, which we all, deal with relatively often. That's including coastal flooding, riverine, flooding generated by stormwater runoff, severe weather events, which are, unfortunately becoming greater and more frequent, including high winds and nor'easters, drought, with a focus on watershed and wetland preservation, extreme temperatures. And as I said, this is sort of defining the variables by which we're evaluating our strengths, weaknesses, our infrastructure, and all those components. You could reference the summary of findings report, and I'm happy to go through any, at a later date, the detail of it. But what's really, I find, impressive and enjoyable with this whole process is the actual matrix of vulnerabilities that we're able to assess sort of in a more technical capacity, but that's going to be really great material for a future consultant to analyze and use in their future planning. So in terms of the actual summary of findings report that you have, and I know it clearly highlights the overall areas of concern, the infrastructure and facility concerns, the concerns we all identified in terms of our ecosystems, waterways, forests, our infrastructure network, road, bridges, road networks, and also vulnerable populations. These impacts, these environmental impacts affect people differently based on where they're at in their life. And that is something that I think we need to, be very cognizant of as we advance planning, moving forward. There's a lot of specific concerns and challenges identified by workshop participants. That's that sort of laundry list of priority actions that you identified. And the ones rising to the top are really focused on, the discussion that we had. I'll show you a slide in a little bit that was really interesting. We broke off into groups and we kind of all came out to report back, and we identified a lot of the similar concerns, which is relatively unheard of. We took a hard look at our strengths and assets. Each group individually did that. We actually broke the 35 participants into 4 or 5 groups. And actually each catalog what we thought Norwalk's strengths were, what the assets were, and then the groups collectively came up with what they felt were the most priority recommendations. And that's what we try to reflect in the report. So it's obviously not an entirely exhaustive list. It's a reflection of what the discussion was at the workshop, and then a first cut at trying to prioritize some of these things based on our discussion. So, future planning is obviously going to involve a lot more community discussion. It's going to involve discussion with all of you and many other stakeholders to determine that ultimate final list. But this is the start to kind of get that out there and get the discussion started. So in terms of some of the recommendations, there were some initial prioritization that occurred. Really wanted us to focus that we had to make sure we maintain a long-term vision and adequately accommodate growth that we're expecting. There was various infrastructure improvements that were identified. I won't go through them all since they were pretty exhaustive, but they are included in the report. And I encourage you to go look at, some of the things that were coming out of DPW, that were coming out of the people that deal with this every day. I'm a firm believer when you start a plan like this, at least as the first cut, talk to people in operations because they deal with these struggles every day. This is a part of their everyday thinking. Looking at various quality of life improvements, and obviously emergency management is a huge component of this. And we were fortunate to have a lot of representation from that angle at our workshop. So again, the summary findings has the detailed publication of all these actions, sort of organized by initial prioritization. But this is really what I found was the meat of the workshop, and it really generated a lot of a conversation. So just going back, we met as a group, looked at the initial data that Adam pulled together, Nature Conservancy pulled together. We broke off into groups to discuss these strengths, vulnerabilities, infrastructure concerns, what we think is affecting Norwalk, how we can address it, and recommendations. And then the last part of the workshop, we all got out and we reported back. So we each assigned a leader to report back to the larger group and show what those groups' priorities were. So what you have here on the side is that the actual outcomes of the groups. So this is group 1, 2, 3, 4, and what their top priority was. And the most interesting thing is that this color coding shows the groups that thought the same thing, which, when you get 35 people in a room, I would be surprised if you could even all agree on where to go to dinner, let alone what the top priorities were. So I think that we were actually pretty impressed. And what that priority ultimately was, is that Norwalk needs an organizational structure in place this could be the focus, and making sure that the administrative is a top priority. So that whatever happens, whatever comes out of these planning initiatives, whatever comes out of it, whatever investments the council approves to make, have a dedicated source, people thinking about this all the time, and someone to work between the departments to figure out, how DPW, how economic development and planning, how emergency management can integrate sustainability, resilience, and climate action in their daily workflow. Other priorities, it didn't really divest too much. I think the more consensus we had was also around education and making sure that we, structure outreach programs that were meaningful to everyone. So making sure that we, reach out to every part of the community, making sure that we help people get to where we are in terms of our understanding, because we deal with this every day. Not everyone does, but it is important to everyone's life. So really just trying to figure out a way to increase our outreach, to increase our way to educate people about these topics, to ultimately help move these plans forward. And I think, funding is obviously an issue, but that was one of the most encouraging pieces of it. It was looking at what we could do with what we have first, and then saying, okay, optimize that. And then let's figure out what we can do from a funding perspective and a project-based perspective. A lot of people obviously trees advocating for certain specific sidewalk, trail improvements, various berms, various public infrastructure projects. But I think what this matrix represents is sort of the portfolio of options that the group identified to help address resilience and climate change, just as the data dump from their brain. And what the intent is in terms of next step, and we're putting together a procurement for an actual, formal climate action plan. And what this is that attachment to that RFP or whatever that looks like, saying, here's what we got together, here's what we identified. Rather than having a consultant go and have interview by interview, we saved a lot of time, we saved a lot of money, as this was a pro bono effort to get this done now. We attach that and we say, all right, consultant community, come back to us. How do we do it? What do you think else we need to do? How do we prioritize? And let's talk to the community. So that's the sort of high level overview. I'm happy to expand on anything if you have any questions, but that'll be it for me for now.
Great, thanks, Brian. Do any of our committee members have questions for Brian or about the process or some of the things we discussed that day? Josh, you just unmuted. Is that?
Yeah. So Brian, this is great. I guess obviously this is the 3,000 foot, 30,000 foot high level kind of think here. Can you, so that the public understands and also so that we get in a sense of sort of what happens next? Because a lot of the issues identified are stuff that is really important and also stuff that has been talked about a So what, in terms of a vision, and you talked about a climate action plan, like what's next?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, so the next immediate step is obviously putting out a procurement for a climate action plan. I know that's something that the group wants to do, a full exhaustive effort, getting under the hood under all of this, right? I think this is kind of going to the mechanic saying, hey, I got a couple things wrong. And what we're trying to do is basically have someone come in and take a deep dive into these areas and figure out how we could get to some of these objectives, while at the same time identifying new things. We've obviously missed things. There's things that we need to add. But this is really the starting point for that discussion. So the next step is the climate action plan. And from there, you're going to have, I think, the axioms that we identified that I think are going to be the most focused are obviously the administrative environment, the public infrastructure components, the community outreach and education, and then also the science behind all of it. I think, we wanted to figure out, rather than put out a blanket request for some technical analysis, we want to figure out those action areas that merit the most technical analysis, so we could try to have the most streamlined budget for the project as well. So that I'd say that's the general immediate next step.
And look, I mean, obviously that's important. I imagine the RFP process by the time you hire someone, and this is a years long thing here. Obviously, considering the top priority for most of the groups was about designating a staff person, and obviously, thinking about hiring and establishing a department here. And we've got a budget cycle coming up. I mean, how should the city be approaching this? Is this something that we need to start pushing people to think about, in terms of hiring and strategizing now? Or do we have to wait for a whole climate action plan before we begin sort of building that administrative portfolio?
I think it's going to require more discussions, but I could say there was it was a unanimous recommendation that the administrative environment needs to be addressed, and the first and foremost, in making sure. I'm a firm believer, and I was talking to Tom about this earlier today. A best practice in planning is to do a comprehensive plan. So you're, taking a holistic approach and then implement from there, right? You don't want to get into a situation when you shoot first and aim later. But I think that things can be done iteratively. So it's not as if this is just, okay, we have to wait a year or whatever it is. I would argue that we'd want to expedite that to 6 to 9 month program. And that is actionable given what we just did in terms of identifying existing conditions. A consultant could come in and they're not going to have to do all these department by department interviews. I mean, they're going to want to check some things, ask some questions, but we did a lot of that work on the front end. That's typically 3 to sometimes 6 months of a planning cycle for something like this. So this was the intent of this, to expedite the plan. So, but back to the administrative point, we want to get that out, but certain things are going to become apparent through those conversations. So I don't think that we need to completely wait until the end of it, but I think that we want to be methodical in our approach. And I think that's just a general best practice when you start doing any of these things for them to have the most impact.
And by the way, I agree wholeheartedly with that. I was laying out the question just to kind of see, are there things we can do to, as you were talking about, expedite the process, because it's here,
Right.
And even though we did not experience, frankly, the level of flooding this year that we experienced last year, we did experience a drought. These things are real. So, I realize I'm preaching to the choir here. So I really appreciate the work you've done. And obviously there's a lot more to do.
Yeah, just so you know, we had a conversation today, and I actually just got off the phone with Jess before we had this, is we fully agree with the sequencing, and we're going to be getting together with Steve and Tom and Lisa and trying to see what low-hanging fruit exists in the meantime. There's a few things that come to mind, and I think we could be working, it's not all or nothing. You know what I mean? And I think that what was really encouraging, and what I can say is it was very impressive hearing how people in all of the departments view their job. The perspective of sustainability, conservation, the future in terms of what that looks like is permeated throughout the departments already. So that's a great starting point. I think what it is about formalizing some of those informal networks, and then us obviously looking for areas where it may not be occurring and make sure that it does.
I think one thing that you impressed upon me with our conversation a little bit earlier today, preparing for this meeting, was there's just a lot of pressure on the Common Council and the City of Norwalk to come up with metrics that we should live by. Like, when should we begin to decide when carbon neutrality should happen? When should Norwalk aspire for carbon negativity? And it seems as though these are great things to aspire for, and it seems as though other cities are putting benchmarks out there, but it also seems as though that's a little bit cart before the horse. And could you talk a little bit about that and share
Yeah.
share what you shared with Tom and me about that? We thought that was helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, part of it is a little premature, but it's also there's certain just good planning practices and data points that we can start cataloging. We, as a group, even through this process or in this group, have identified those key benchmarks and things that we want to strive for. So I think that's something that we can start preparing now at least, and then vet those through the planning process. So I think it's not that we have to stop everything and wait for that outcome to come to us. I think we can be proactive in that regard. I mean, there's a lot of just data points that we could start gathering, as I was talking to you, Lisa, that we've done, internationally, that people use as their benchmarks for monitoring performance, whether that's emissions, whether that's, amount of waste, whether that's their socioeconomic monitoring. We could do that now. And I think that's one of the examples to Josh's question, that what can we be doing now versus what we have to wait for? What can we be doing now that we could start and then refine through the process? So I think that's how I would view kind of what you're talking about, Lisa.
Yeah, and I think sort of as a follow-up, and I'd love to hear from our committee members who are here today about is, what can we do in future sustainability committee meetings to highlight these concerns and then educate the public along that? And so one of the thoughts was perhaps we should be having that conversation about benchmarking, just what you said, starting with the carbon and considering garbage collection, et cetera, et cetera. So Josh and Dominique, Tom heard this already. Are those things interesting to you? Or, what other thoughts do you have about what we could be highlighting here in our committee before we get to the work of looking at the RFQ and then deciding what happens with the climate action plan that we expect in 6 to 9 months?
Yeah, but Lisa, before you let them answer, maybe just expound on something you just said. Maybe Brian, you can give a little more color about what you're talking about for like the European
Yeah, the benchmarking.
benchmarking you talked about before. I mean, that's really interesting. I thought, and maybe to share that now before, so people get a nice sense of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't have it readily available, but I could speak to it. So I was involved in 2014. I was living in Germany working for SAP doing Smart Cities, Future Cities Initiative. And one of the efforts that I was teamed up with was referred to as Morgenstadt. It was the city of the future. And what they developed and they actually implemented globally across some of the largest metro areas was basically an evaluation matrix to take a look at the sustainability and resilience of the city, almost creating a scorecard. And they had 83 indicators that were all quantitative. They were all data points in terms of what we're talking about. And I could get the exhaustive list, and I'm happy to share this with you in terms of where you are today and, where you should be, and you kind of have something to track. So I picture something like that for Norwalk, whether it's, it's obviously that's an international effort. We can make it more locally specific. And there's a lot of different benchmarks. A lot of different organizations have come up with these sort of rubrics and grading systems. I think what we can do is find the one that we feel works best for us, that aligns with our values. But that's definitely something I'm happy to share with you all. There's actually a paper that was done on it, but they did, I think it was Berlin, Tokyo, NYC, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and they basically ranked the sustainability, generated a report. And I think that could be something that's very valuable for Norwalk, because it sort of sets the framework for future performance monitoring. So where we are today, what's the snapshot, and then we could figure out, you have your goal, and then you have something to track on every year. You can report out, kind of where you're at. Did that answer enough, Tom, or you want any more detail?
No, I think that's great. I mean, I think gives an idea of what we were talking about earlier. And
And is this something that's sort of included in the climate action plan? Would that be something we could charge them with establishing the where we are today type so we can?
Yeah, and that's what it is. And I think this is the discussion that we could have, so taking feedback now in terms of what we think we should be assessing, what we should be planning, because the way we sort of drafted the procurement for the RFP, at least as the initial stage, it still needs to go through a number of city reviews. Is to keep it relatively open, saying, hey, look, we did this workshop. Here we have the findings of it. These are some of the aspirational goals. It's obviously not fully complete yet, but we wanted to give it to you as a starting point. How do we get there? What do we do? What's your firm's approach to getting us there? And what should success look like, even if we're missing a few things? And having at least some openness for firms to propose their approaches, rather than try to be overly prescriptive on the front end and then, box ourselves in. So I think that's what's one thing that's encouraging about this upcoming procurement is it's not a lockbox. So there's still an opportunity to have these discussions and evaluate different approaches and see what may work best for Norwalk. But yes, to your question, I mean, this is an exercise in data collection and analysis. I would rather them do this than have to go reinvent the wheel, interviewing everybody separately, spending a lot of consulting hours. I think this is a good start for them, but then they could get more into the nitty gritty about what we're talking about if that's something of interest to this group.
Thoughts, anybody further? Dominique Johnson?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just want to thank everybody. You know, I was present at that, and I do want to echo how it was wonderful to see everybody kind of in sync and with eyes toward the future about what we need to do, especially the city staff. I want to commend everybody. And so with that said, I think it's wonderful that we did this pro bono, because this gives us, you know, as you've been saying, Brian, the consulting on this would have been pretty exorbitant, I could imagine. So that's great. And here we have, because of our funding from ARPA, to see this through, like this climate action plan on the horizon. So for me, I think what's most important, as you said, are these metrics and the benchmarks, because then we can measure our progress toward the goal. And so I'd like to, you know, I think that, to your point, Chair, like that's something I'm really curious about, what we can focus on, and so that they're clear to the community, so that they can even see the progress as we're making it. Because as we talked about, communication is going to be key, because we're already doing things in the city that are very much, as we've talked about, like infused with sustainability. So the communication piece is great. Lastly, I guess for me, what's really important is to make sure that because this is an action plan, and we're always talking about making sure things are actionable, I would love to know kind of, and I guess this gets back to the metrics, like how we know we will have achieved what we want to achieve, and then what resources we're going to need in addition to achieve these goals. I don't know if we're going to do ambitious goals, stretch goals, or I think the whole point of the plan is to do something that's doable, right? So that was, I guess, less of a question than I intended, but I think, but I guess that's my just to make sure it's quite actionable for Norwalk is important, because I know one of the things that came out, which we talked about, is the need to reinforce and strengthen for disasters that could happen, God forbid, like a superstorm Sandy, while at the same time increasing our sustainability, being future forward about that at the same time. So, and balancing those priorities. So I just want to thank everybody, and I think that this is a great first step, given especially what we were able to do pro bono, and to get everybody acknowledged as being on the same page, and not even having to get people on the same page is such, I think, a great finding in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I just pulled up some of the things I think answer your question, as well as further elaborate on Tom. So this is a select list of sort of benchmarks that are the type of thinking that we could engage in to figure out, how do we know when we've arrived, right? Or where are we trying to go? So these are some of the, out of the 83 indicators, I think these are 24 of them, or I can't remember what subset, but it's really, you know, some are very technical, some are very just general, and some are socioeconomic, right? And what it is, we're just monitoring them within the framework of sustainability, things that we're meeting the current needs with, you know, also considering the future. So you have share, you know, increase in population, you're taking a look at, you know, your community composition, maintaining an eye on that, as recognizing that has an impact on the environment, and has an impact on the equity piece, the share of green parks, your NO2, your amount of waste, your CO2 emissions, your ecological footprint, the GDP, and how much renewable energy you're using, what's your public spending on education. These are all indicators that are easily quantifiable for our community. And we could bring something like this into the benchmarking process. And I think what we could do for the time being is start defining what these are. You know what I mean? We have these as a starting point. I'll get the full exhaustive list. There's a lot of other models that are actually local specific to the US as well, that we could kind of start picking from. And then we could start having a conversation as a group to say, okay, how should we be monitoring, measuring our success? You know, the old adage, what can't be measured can't be improved.
No, I think that would be great. I think that would be great to spend, 15 or 20 minutes or half an hour, whatever we need at one of our meetings, to go through this with our committee and, see what we think are the important things that ought to be incorporated.
Yeah, great.
That'd be great. Terrific. Any other thoughts about future meetings? Mr. Goldstein.
Yeah, no, I think this is great. And I took a quick pass through this, and I need to do a deeper dive. But I did notice that there are goals and items that are listed that certainly are could happen sooner rather than later, including, for example, there was a point there about rewriting zoning regulations so that I think the language was to include incentives for modifications, including green stormwater infrastructure, which like there are whole communities in Norwalk that desperately need this. Rowayton and West Norwalk certainly come to mind. Like they're doing a zoning regulations rewrite now, like you know that. I guess my question is sort of triaging what happens now, what happens later. I realize that loftier goals. So for example, I don't know if there's something where we want to do something like being carbon neutral by X year or something along those lines. Like Tom and Lisa, you guys are a little ahead of me on that, but I just am trying to get a sense of what are things that we can achieve and really push for now, and especially in the coming budget cycle, versus stuff that we need to think about in terms of 5 and 10-year goals. And things that we can begin to sort of work with our state delegation and maybe potential future state delegation on getting for us.
Yeah, well, perhaps maybe, and I mentioned this meeting that we're going to have with Steve, Jess, and Lisa and Tom and whoever, you know, that works out. Maybe we take a deep dive through the priority actions and just kind of see what we think may be a low hanging fruit right now. And maybe that'll.
I think that would be a
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Really helpful. And I'm not above trying to lobby our fellow city mates to say that the planning and zoning regulations are a big opportunity right now. And it's not something that Common Council has any influence on, other than to keep saying out loud that we really hope that we take giant steps and not small steps in looking at regulations that could be helpful in the future, because these are hard things to amend in the future. Josh, you can talk more eloquently about it than I, as you sat on the commission.
Yeah, I mean, the process started before I got on the zoning commission, and that was years ago. So I know this has been a long time coming, and I know that there's work to do. It's just I don't need to repeat it. I think that going through an exercise of triaging what can happen now, what can happen later, I think would be useful for everyone involved.
Great.
Exactly. Great. Any other comments? I know that people have 7 o'clock meetings, so I'm respectful of people's times and wanting to, close one book and open another. So if there's no other discussion about this, Brian, thank you so much for taking the deep dive. We really want to thank your staff for, we did take a couple drafts over the course of the summer. And as I said to you and Katie earlier, what looked like a B+, you turned into an A+. It looks terrific. There's probably going to be some more work that we might want to do on it, between now and whenever we give it to the people who we hire through the RFP. But thank you so much. That was a heavy, heavy lift, and it looks fantastic. And I thought it was actually very readable, other than some people in public comments who thought maybe it was harder to read, maybe because we were so close to it. I thought it actually read really spectacularly well and was completely comprehensive of what the discussion on May 26th was. So thank you for that work too.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
And also, I'm sorry, just to reiterate, thank you, Brian, for bringing Adam and the Nature Conservancy to the city. I mean, you brought that in. I mean, that was great. I mean, we talked about this, I don't know, right, beginning of the last January or something, and you brought him right in, and it was great. And you got all the context, so thank you.
I'm glad it worked out. Yeah.
It worked out. So please thank Adam for us. I actually have a phone call with him about trees next week. So I'll thank
Great.
the more thanks he gets, I don't think he can get enough thanks for the effort that they put in. It was spectacular. Really, really terrific work. We really appreciate it. Well, great. I will take a motion to adjourn if anybody would like to offer one. Mr. Goldstein, thank you. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. And we will see you next month.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Have a great
Carol.
night.
Thank you, Willow.
Good night,
Thank you.
everybody.